Wait, chat, is this good? The 2025 budget. Oh boy, the Liberal government just put out their brand new 2025 budget, and it is everything. I understand a lot of people don't like looking at budgets, but this sets the policy and priorities for years to come and has deep impacts on your life. Let's look at the budget and see what's in it and see how good it is or bad it is. All right, so the 2025 budget context, just out of the way. Published on November 4th, 2025, the Liberals described this budget as a generational austerity and investment budget required to transform our economy. This comes after 8 or so months of Donald Trump's endless escapades that have collectively bruised, beaten, and battered Canadians. It's being debated in Parliament right now, so it's not currently law, and we don't know if it'll pass. Mark Carney's Liberals have a minority government, so they need the support from a few other members of Parliament to pass it. It will be a Liberal failure if the budget doesn't receive enough support. And in that case, we will probably have another election. So, more context. The Liberals are led by Mark Carney. Mark Carney is a comically elite asset management CEO, World Banker cartoon. Think Smithers, but somehow worse. Think Mr. Krabs, if you put Mr. Krabs in charge of 2 national banks.
First of all, congratulations, Mr. Krabs.
Hello, I like money.
What inspired you to build a second Krusty Krab right next door to the original?
Money.
That's Mark Carney. I believe Mark Carney thinks he is the CEO of Canada and can strong-arm a budget into passing. His rich CEO attitude is kind of sprinkled all over this budget, like austerity and sacrifice. This budget has 5 chapters. It's essentially a 400-page corporate slideshow. I reviewed and graded each section. To be upfront about my biases, I will grade this budget and the policies based on their benefit to the working class. Chapters that support the working class will be graded a higher rank than chapters that support capital and the wealthy elite. I'll share my grades after going over all 5 chapters and then give it an overall mark and then my final thoughts. Oh boy, all of that context out of the way, let's dig into the details. All right, Chapter 1, Building a Stronger Canadian Economy. The investment part of this budget is centered around handouts to billionaires and companies. This chapter frames a lower corporate tax rate, a dozen other handouts as catalyzing the private sector. The budget claims that doing these handouts will jumpstart growth and grow productivity. Quote, to help drive this transformation, the government is focused on catalyzing private sector investment in Canada, investment in machinery, equipment, and innovation that enhances long-term growth and will help jumpstart and sustain productivity growth. Section 1.1, Accelerating Major Nation Building Projects. Right off the start, Mark Carney justifies eliminating Indigenous rights as fast-track projects. Essentially, the Liberals passed laws that allow them to overrule Indigenous opposition to destructive projects. Under international law, First Nations have the right to free, prior, and informed consent to projects on their land. This is the bare minimum for rights of Indigenous peoples. Carney downgraded it from that to meaningful consultation and meaningful participation. So Carney just stripped them of their rights like that. Quote, the government will uphold Section 35 of our Constitution and the duty to consult, and the government's commitment to implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including free, prior, and informed consent, as we build Canada strong. Now, committing to implementing is how elite CEO bankers say, we aren't doing that right now. CEO Carney, the 10-plus millionaire, sees Indigenous people as a hurdle and speed bump in building Canada's nation-building projects. Denying rights is a core principle of their accelerating projects. They need to remove speed bumps so they can accelerate. It's that simple, and that's what's in the budget. For human rights, it's simply wrong. Section 1.2, supercharging growth. The budget plans on supercharging growth with a productivity super deduction. That is elite speak for cutting taxes on rich people and gigantic corporations. The budget cuts the effective tax rate for corporations by, on average, 2.4%. That varies with sectors. I think manufacturing is down almost at 0%. These tax cuts for corporations makes Canada's marginal tax rate the lowest among allies, G7 countries like UK, France, the US, etc. This policy is just giving away free money to corporations. That's our money, handed to the wealthy elite, while Carney demands sacrifices of the working class. He wants us to sacrifice more? More? You gotta be kidding me. Bitch, we've been sacrificing. The masses suffer to feed the elite's greed. Quote, with the productivity super deduction, Canada's METRs, marginal effective tax rates, are competitive with those in the US across most sectors, particularly in manufacturing and processing. We'll get back into this later, but this also includes some really funny tax cuts, like cutting taxes on yachts. That's further down in the budget, but I just think it's so comically stupid that I had to mention it here. Section 1.2 also includes spending over $1 billion to give corporations tools to use AI. The Liberal government is paying companies and rich people to fire and replace workers with AI. Doesn't seem like a very smart strategy to me, just firing people and replacing them with computers who can make mistakes and will make mistakes in government functions and across the private sector. This includes billions for the Venture and Growth Capital Catalyst Initiative to leverage private venture capital, other institutional investors, and fund managers. These are all words for not you. Quote, taking back control over the immigration system is under the supercharging growth chapter, which is almost unheard of because apparently denying entry to people looking for a better life is supercharging growth, guys. It's for sure not just racistly tying economic budgetary measures to immigration policy. It's for sure not just racist, I promise. Yeah, so this section is not much of a dog whistle. It's just more outrightly saying we want fewer immigrants in this country. The budget brags that asylum claims are down by a third, and temporary residents, like students and workers, is being cut in half. These measures lower the government revenue by hundreds of millions of dollars. Call me crazy, but Canada needs more immigrants to meet our requirements, and we have the need, space, wealth, and spirit to invite more people to our beautiful country. Canada is a country outside of the Indigenous and First Nations built entirely on immigration, and it is a massive strength. We are a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic state that blends all different cultures from across the world, and we benefit from that. We need more people in Canada to build a better future. Too bad all the wealth is sitting at the top 1%, and we refuse to build adequate housing numbers to keep housing prices down. So for the government, it is simply easier to lean into the racist framing to blame immigrants for failures of neoliberal governments. The budget tries to tie immigration, international students, refugees, and growth together as an impediment to the economy. And I think that's a real shame and just indicative of how far right-wing this government is. Section 1.3, Canada's Climate Competitiveness Strategy. The budget starts this part with, quote, climate action is not just a moral obligation, it's an economic necessity. This budget section goes on to describe how Canada needs to produce more fossil fuels, which by definition, increases and worsens climate change. The Liberal budget, by its own words, fails to meet its own moral obligation to satisfy their economic greed. It is a moral failing of the government as they commit to more emissions and more fossil fuels, more devastation of the climate and society. This section also includes billions in handouts for mining companies. Let's look at one of the graphs they present to support more Canadian fossil fuel production. So this graph breaks down GHG, greenhouse gas intensity for various oil-producing countries, separated into 3 categories: extraction, processing, refining, then transport, and methane venting and flaring. Notably, Canada's GHG production intensity is the second highest on the chart. More importantly, this graph doesn't include the greenhouse gases emitted by burning these fossil fuels. One of the main ways fossil fuels get out there, you burn fossil fuel, you get CO2, methane in the atmosphere, and that's how we get climate change. That's just basic science. So this graph excludes that part, arguably the most important part, and it is completely hidden. The plan, quote, aims to maximize carbon value for money. Note, again, we're focusing on money instead of reducing emissions to zero. So another moral failing. Carbon value for money, this is elite banker speak for more fossil fuels at a maybe lower carbon/GHG intensity. This is a policy that is anti-science, anti-youth, and is designed to sacrifice the youth and next generation's vulnerable people to climate disaster for the oil billionaires in their ivory towers to make a quick buck. Very notably, this budget does not refer to the climate crisis once. 400 some odd pages, they don't use the phrase climate crisis because liberals stupidly think that the crisis can simply be ignored for corporate profits in the short term. Reducing emissions is not the end goal of green transition. The goal is elimination of greenhouse gas emissions. More fossil fuels definitionally moves Canada away from that goal. Our collective moral duty, a duty that I take seriously, but the CEOs do not, because they don't care about you. To cap things off of this section, the budget says anti-greenwashing laws are creating uncertainty and reversing efforts to protect the environment. Getting rid of greenwashing laws is just an explicitly pro-corporation, pro-destruction reversal of previous policy. Now big fossil fuel companies can lie and greenwash their fossil fuel production to smooth things over with the public. This is a stupid plan. Section 1.4, increasing competition. I don't have much to say on this section, but it centers around having a smaller government to unlock capital, catalyzing investment for insurers and financial institutions, helping banks, introducing legislation that allows banks to issue cryptocurrency stablecoins. Stablecoins have historically not been stable. The most successful one was Tether, which turned out to be a massive fraud and it went bankrupt. A complete collapse of the stablecoin not very stable. One good thing I will say about this section is partially restricting non-compete agreements, which is a step towards pro-worker policies. Non-compete agreements are terrible for workers and only serve as a downward pressure on wages. So that's chapter 1, done and out of the way. Let's go on to chapter 2. Chapter 2, shifting from reliance to resilience. Chapter 2 is centered around the Trump/American trade war with Canada. The trade war is obviously devastating Canadian workers across the country. And the Liberals can't control what Trump does, but we have to judge the Liberals on what they do, their policies to fight a trade war. Section 2.1, Protecting Canada's Strategic Industries. This section is mostly about handouts to industries particularly targeted and affected by the trade war, like steel, auto, lumber. Billions, billions, and billions to these companies. Also included is corporate handouts for agriculture, fish, seafood production. Large enterprise tariff loan is an introduced slush fund that gives vast sums of money to large corporations like Algoma Steel. There's also this, quote, Pivot to Grow program, and it's a bucket of money to give to smaller and medium-sized companies. Also included is the deferral of corporate income tax to give more money to businesses. Not you. Not the working class. Also included in Section 2.1 is the Buy Canadian policy, which I do generally think is a good policy in theory. The budget calls it being our own best customers, and I can generally get behind this. We should focus on local productive investments and being more self-sufficient with our economy and production, so that's generally something I can get behind. Section 2.2, Growing Canada's Trade with the World. The budget says it plans to double the exports of goods to non-US markets over the next 10 years. Now, I think every Canadian generally agrees diversification away from US empire is a good thing. We don't like being completely captured by whatever madman in the White House at the time. So Canada should be trying to end American hegemony over Canada. One good element of this is building up ports and vital infrastructure that generally benefits workers in the short and long term. However, this does include things in northern Canada where the government, I remind you, plans on stripping Indigenous rights or speed bumps as Mark Carney views them. So it's double-edged sword on that front. Additionally, this section describes their trade impact program, which is giving $5 billion to large Canadian exporters to subsidize them. Additionally, it intends on giving $2 billion to international companies / partners as incentives to buy Canadian. This budget is aiming to primarily partner with the Indo-Pacific and Europe. Included under that heading is continental defense and your Ukrainian reconstruction. Their plan is expressly to buy European weapons of war and send a boatload of cash to Ukraine. So we're going to move on to Chapter 3, Empowering Canadians. The budget frames this section as tackling affordability, building homes, and protecting Canadian values. This chapter covers things the closest to working class daily lives, so the closest to home. So I'm expecting big things from this if we want to see improvement in working class material conditions, because the working class are in pain. It's social violence inflicted across the board through years of neoliberal policies, reducing public service, reducing services offered to the public, shrinking government. Our material conditions are worsening. Everything sucks. Particularly for Gen Z and Gen Alpha, we see no hope, no future, and we can't afford right now. We are in an affordability crisis. For this chapter to be graded well, it must meet that critical crisis moment. So let's see. Let's dig in. Section 3.1. Supercharging home building across the country. The budget says that in order to return to 2019 housing prices, Canada needs to build around 500,000 houses a year. Their plan centers around, quote, to turn this around, the government of Canada will catalyze, their word again, catalyze, a more productive home building industry with fewer barriers and less red tape so that builders can build homes at scale we need. This is just CEO Carney giving away more of your money, our money, to subsidize billions to wealthy developers and builders across the country. I'm incredibly skeptical that that would get us anywhere near where we need to be to actually get affordable housing. So the budget's flagship policy on housing is called Build Canada Homes. Quote, Build Canada Homes will transform how the public and private sector work together, deploying modern construction methods and catalyzing an entirely new Canadian housing industry. It will leverage public lands, offer flexible financial incentives, attract private capital, and facilitate large portfolio projects, and support manufacturers to deliver housing at scale. I'm going to translate that from CEO ruling class to normal. We're going to sell public lands to private companies or lease them, whatever, give money to companies, and lower corporate tax rates. Quote, the private sector will bring construction capacity, innovation, supply chains, and financing. Public-private partnership does not deliver better lives for the working class. Canada's endless worship, capitalism, feeds these private corporations who maximize profits every quarter. The key contradiction of maximizing profits from labor doesn't lead to improved material conditions for the working class. Corporations profit off people's exploited labor and pain. So there's that key contradiction with the public-private partnership. One side is in theory supposed to advocate for the working class and Canadians, and the other side is doing the exact opposite. So when you just give a bunch of money to the side doing the opposite and wanting to make some money, that's what they're going to do. So this budget's flagship housing policy, Build Canada Homes, is founded on putting profits before people, and CEO Mark Carney doesn't care about you or your family. Section 3.2, Tackling Affordability. First of all, why is affordability only one section of the budget? This is the core to working class pains across Canada, the things that we feel every day, because we live in an affordability crisis. The working class cannot afford to live in Canada. Every day, our material conditions get worse. Rent goes up, price of groceries, schooling, childcare, housing, food security, and an overall economic recession. So this single section must have a lot of packed into it to really address those key concerns. Let's see. The middle class tax cut going from 15% to 14%. This is the big opener of this section, where you could get, as a family, up to $840. Wow, that sounds great, right? Too bad this tax cut has already happened, and guess what? Shit still sucks, and it's getting worse. This middle class tax cut is bullshit and actually generally only benefits the wealthy. It unlocks more money for them to throw into the stock market. The second policy in this section is, quote, canceling Canada's divisive consumer carbon price, slightly reducing gas prices for a short period of time. What is hidden is how most Canadians, working class Canadians, actually got more money back from the carbon tax, and the ruling class stood to benefit by canceling this. So they can just frame it as divisive and get rid of it, and now you have a tax cut for the wealthy. How perfect is that? And all the while, we are likely going to increase emissions by removing this carbon tax. Third policy I want to cover in this section is the National School Food Program being made permanent, totaling $216 million a year. But that only covers 400,000 kids per year. This is generally a good program. Feeding kids is our priority and duty, but I don't think this goes anywhere near far enough. This program should be expanded and made universal and permanent everywhere. That would actually go about tackling some of these things, but a good program nonetheless. The Youth Climate Corps. My understanding is this was a Green NDP request for the budget. Quote, investing in paid green skills and job placement positions Canada to be effective by equipping workforce needed to build a climate competitive economy. So broadly speaking, a youth climate corps is a very good idea. Hiring and equipping young workers to develop skills needed for the future and the climate crisis. However, it's only $40 million over 2 years for training, seemingly, which is the whole policy. So CEO Carney put a tiny amount of money in defense of our future, training youth, additional emergency responses, but handouts are given left, right, and center to the tune of billions and billions and billions to the wealthy elite. This program, while good, it just seems like a $40 million pilot program that goes nowhere near far enough to address the crises and the emergencies we will face in 2026 and beyond. Section 3.3. Protecting Canadian culture, values, and identity. This section includes small amounts of additional money for some arts, culture, and CBC, but again, not really nearly enough investing in the working class. They have this graph that shows the number of enrollments and people affected by their social policies, and to the Liberals' credit on this budget, they did not destroy social programs nearly as much as people thought they might, but that's not really a good thing. If it's like someone saying, I'm gonna cut off your hand, and then they only cut off your pinky, it's not good. They don't deserve a lot of credit for not cutting off your hand, you know? But overall, most of the money and changes to the budget in Chapter 3 is tax cuts and money for corporations and an overall private-public partnership. Private-public partnership, it's gonna be so good. Moving on to Chapter 4. Chapter 4, Protecting Canada's Sovereignty and Security. Here we go. This section is about military, policing, borders, etc. Canadians agree there is an existential threat to our sovereignty. That threat is Trump and American fascism, the 51st state threat of annexation. This has been a hallmark of the Trump administration, and he seems pretty hell-bent on it, and I believe him. Polls show a majority of Canadians say America is the greatest threat to our country by far. There are also many ongoing wars, genocides, and humanitarian crises happening around the globe, with Canada's involvement and complicity varying. Ukraine, Palestine, Sudan, Congo, too many others to name. For this chapter to get a good grade, it must protect working class Canadians from America's fascism, and it must advocate and take action for peace abroad and strict adherence to international laws and human rights. So let's see how Chapter 4 of the budget holds. Section 4.1, defending our sovereignty. Broadly, this part of the budget is about investing in war and defense, military. Now, Canada's military is completely integrated with NATO and the US military industrial complex. NATO integration is a glaring, self-evident weakness to Canadian sovereignty. Canadians didn't want more integration with American military. We wanted less, so we could rely less on them militarily and economically. So while we're talking about NATO, maybe some listeners are fans of NATO. They see Russia as super scary, and maybe China and Iran. I will tackle that with 3 questions. 3 questions on NATO that you should ask and answer yourself truthfully. First question is, who leads and decides NATO's direction? The true answer is NATO is almost exclusively led by America to enforce American empire and imperialism abroad. For example, most recent example, 5% of GDP spent on military is a Trump demand. He just said it and they were like, okay, we'll do it. More evidence is how the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, the highest office in NATO, openly calls Trump daddy in public and in private text messages to Trump. So that should tell you everything you need there. Yes, America leads and decides the direction of NATO, always have. Question 2, is America a fascist state? Yes. If you want to argue that, I say open your eyes, look at the mass deportations, the concentration camps, violent wars of aggression and imperialism across the globe. Yeah, next question. Question 3. Should Canada be in a military alliance commanded by a fascist America? The answer is no. Canada must leave NATO. We don't want to be in the fascist military alliance. And I hope I'm not alone on that. CEO Carney, as I alluded to, has committed to quadrupling Canada's military budget over the next decade, specifically at Trump's request, without any concessions from the Trump or NATO broadly. Expanding our NATO military is definitionally increasing our integration and reliance on the United States. And this is bad news and the opposite of what Canadians want. The 2025 budget includes a staggering, I've heard conflicting numbers, if it's 100 billion over 5 years or 82 billion, 30 billion, it's not exactly clear, but it's a shitload of money. The 2025 budget includes jumping from 1.4% to 2% immediately, so a large cash infusion into our NATO military. Absent from this defense plan is the acknowledgement of how the United States is the single greatest threat to Canada, economically and militarily. If you genuinely think that Russia or China is gonna come like invade the Arctic, I've got a bridge to sell you, because that is crazy. This fact is excluded from the budget is because CEO Carney is on Team Trump because he wants the bag. He wants it for himself and he wants the bag for his wealthy friends. So you have to ignore that inconvenient fact to keep the money flowing. The budget also describes the plan to expand the number of Canadian troops in Latvia. Quote, the work of the Canadian Armed Forces strengthens NATO's defense of its eastern flank and contributes to the deterrence efforts along Latvia's nearly 300-kilometer border with Russia. If somebody can explain to me how expanding Canada's military footprint in Latvia to defend a fascist-led military alliance is a good idea, I'm all ears, because to me it sounds insane. The budget also provides $300 million to expand Canada's military capabilities in the Middle East. Notably, no Canada in the Middle East. What are we defending? it's Israel. Quote, Canada also launched Operation Amarna, the Canadian Armed Forces' contribution to strengthening peace and security in the Middle East. Operation Amarna allows the Canadian Armed Forces to adapt to changing geopolitical dynamics and respond to emerging security challenges in the region. Canada has spent decades interfering and destroying the Middle East at the request of Israel and America. In the year of our Lord 2025, after watching what Israel has done to Palestine, especially over the past 2 years, but it's been 80 years of occupation and apartheid, we still openly call Israel our ally. For me, not a single dollar should go to Canadian militarization in the Middle East. Our defense is at home, not in the Middle East. When/if the USA invades Canada to make us the 51st state, their army's not going to first go through Eastern Europe and the Middle East to get to Canada. Guess what? They're crossing the St. Lawrence River, having our troops thousands of kilometers away in Latvia, and our capabilities in the Middle East not gonna do anything. And I should say Canadians of conscience are vehemently against wars of aggression. And that is what Israel and America do. Section 4.2, protecting our borders and communities. In this section, we're doing large expansions of RCMP, more Canadian Border Services officers, and I'm very, 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 very skeptical of this. More surveillance and policing of Canadians is not a good policy. It's going to inevitably end up just further marginalizing vulnerable communities and attacking people who say things the government doesn't like. Budget allocates some money to the Meteorological Services of Canada to, quote, modernize it. This is a good policy. Accurate weather data and projections are key functions of society relied upon every day by the working class. I don't know if it goes nearly far enough, but hey, we take small wins. The budget also gives money to a new national public alerting system model. That's another good policy. Alerting the public is key to the safety of working class people. I could be wrong on the size and scope needed to actually adequately address that problem, but at least they're saying that. This budget also continues the assault rifle buyback program from the Trudeau era. We need fewer guns in this country. Continuing this policy is in the right direction of protecting everyday people in Canada. Last point on this section, the budget allocates $250 million over 4 years to lease 4 firefighting aircraft. Now, this policy is a step in the right direction. We obviously need to expand and deepen our defense against climate disasters, including forest fires. I will say that this policy goes nowhere near far enough. We're a big country. We need more than 4 additional because half the country seems to be on fire half the year. We need more than 4 additional planes, and we should own them. We shouldn't be leasing them from others. We should be self-sufficient. Section 4.3, building a stronger Canadian financial system. Just an aside, just a technical thing. Section 4.3 isn't listed on their Chapter 4 table of contents, so our government is making silly errors on their first ever generational investment budget. This is a mistake you see in a high schooler's lab report. Did they not proofread their budget? I thought these guys were supposed to be the adults in the room, the smart business boys in charge. They've been in charge for 7 months. This is a pretty inconsequential point, but it's a signal of liberal incompetence. Okay, back to the contents of Section 4.3. The budget outlines increased combating financial fraud resources, and increased efforts towards reducing fraud is good. So $600 million put towards this is a step in a good direction. Then there's improving insurance resiliency against natural disasters. This part should be named Insurance Resiliency Against Earthquakes because that's the only natural disaster listed. It seems a bit strange, maybe it's an oversight. Even then, the budget only mentions the intention to consult stakeholders. And that's, again, elite banker speak for we're not doing that right now. So, fueled by the climate crisis, disaster intensity and frequency is rapidly increasing. It seems like half the country is on fire for half the year. It affects the air we breathe and causes massive disruptions to civil life. I'm going to come out and be super courageous and say massive forest/urban fires are bad for society. I know. How radical. Just one example is how we all watched Jasper, Alberta lose 1/3 of their total buildings damaged or destroyed by a single forest fire event. So this consulting people on insurance, whatever, on natural disasters goes nowhere far enough. The lion's share of Section 4.2's money is going into military spending, questionable military spending in the fascist-led military alliance. So, yay. Chapter 5, the last chapter, Creating a More Efficient and Effective Government. Now, the title is giving Doge and tax cuts for the elite, living up to their phrase of spending less to invest more. Quote, Canada's new government will balance Canada's operating budget within 3 years by making responsible, pragmatic choices, shifting the composition of spending towards capital investments that will grow the economy and prosperity for Canadians. This is elite banker speak for a wealth transfer from the working class to the ruling elite class. Austerity and sacrifice is to feed their greed. Section 5.1, spending less to invest more. The headline of 5.1 is, quote, to spend less, we are modernizing government operations to deliver better results for Canadians and reduce costs. Through an ambitious savings plan, we are slowing the growth in direct program spending from 8% to under 1%. So that's one way of saying public services are going to shrink and they're not going to grow and expand and offer more services to Canadians. This section is more of CEO Carney trying to run a country like a business. I'll just go over some of these cuts that they put in. So there's $6 billion in cuts to public employee pensions, $4.4 billion cuts to medical marijuana benefits, $2.7 billion cuts to foreign aid, $2.4 billion in cuts to housing support programs, $2.3 billion in cuts to infrastructure projects, $2.1 billion in cuts to the Net Zero Accelerator Fund that promotes green research and development, $500 million in cuts to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, $200 million in cuts, ending the tree planting program that would have planted 1 billion more trees for the bargain price of $200 million. Why does this government hate trees? $600 million in additional cuts to public services, $100 million to take away public servants' dental plans, and $1 billion in cuts to student loans and grants totaling $280 million every year after. These cuts are the direct program cuts. The budget then provides this chart and compares the size of the cuts compared to previous Canadian budgets that cut programs. And the graph shows that CEO Carney's plans are even more austerity than the conservative Stephen Harper's last austerity deficit reduction action plan. So this budget is just objectively more conservative and austerity driven than even our last conservative prime minister. I thought this was supposed to be a liberal. Another massive part of this section is the firing of 16,000 public servants, good-paying jobs in 2025 alone. That number increases up to 40,000 over a few years. So we're cutting jobs, good-paying public servant jobs that benefit the economic and social well-being of the country. What are we going to do to replace them? The budget plans on filling those governmental needs with artificial intelligence. I cannot stress how stupid this is. This is a ridiculous plan. Fire 16,000 people this year, and you expect to replace them maybe with AI? AI that is prone to making mistakes that will directly affect Canadians and their interactions with the government. Quote, through the comprehensive expenditure review, departments have identified ways to use technology to achieve savings by streamlining. So they want to use AI across the board in government. Government IT services, Department of Justice, Transport Canada, and Public Services and Procurement Canada. I, for one, cannot wait to get incorrect information from a government AI bot without any accountability, and they'll just say, oopsies, while firing people during a trade war. This is called a stupid plan. But Mark Carney's got to find cuts somewhere to feed the military-industrial complex and billionaire handouts, so this is where we're at. Regarding unions and collective bargaining, the budget says, quote, in working to renew collective agreements, the government will negotiate fair and reasonable agreements that balance the interest of both employees and taxpayers. At the same time, government will respect labor workers' fundamental rights to organize, collectively bargain, and commence legal labor actions. I really, really despise this section because CEO Carney has already violated Canadian charter rights and fundamental freedoms around labor unions. Look no further than the Air Canada flight attendant strike, where literally hours into the strike, CEO Carney unilaterally declared that that strike is illegal. Now, there is no such thing as an illegal strike. Making a strike illegal is directly removing Canadians' fundamental freedom outlined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. CEO Mark Carney has already taken away our rights, and that's just one example of his anti-labor authoritarianism. So this paragraph they gave on labor rights is complete kabuki theater. They don't mean it, they just lie. Section 5.2, modernizing services. So this section, there is increase in spending for veteran services. This is fine. We should be taking care of our veterans. They're working class people generally. We should be funding them. But it begs the question, why do only certain people get additional funding and help? Working class people need help across the board, not just the veterans. So it really casts a giant shadow over this. This part of the budget also outlines another new policy called, quote, attracting private sector expertise to the public service. Quote, there is a need to bring in talent and perspectives from outside the government into public services at speed and scale. Let me get this straight. So the government fires 16,000 workers and then partially replaces them with, quote, an ambitious immediate term goal of integrating 50 external leaders in technology, finance, science, and other sectors into the public service. So this is a slush fund for elite capitalists to have even more influence over our governments. You can be damn sure Mark Carney's going to prioritize hiring his other CEO and wealthy elite banker friends into these positions. And I'm sure they're going to be paid handsomely, like the major project CEO who's getting a $500,000 salary. Your money. This is a stupid plan. We're going to fire working class people and replace some of them with elite bankers, financial people, etc. Stupid. Section 5.3, a more efficient tax system. In this, we're outlining how the government is cutting taxes on luxury goods, like yachts and private jets. Cutting taxes on these things is framed as overall efficiency, people, for sure. This is just a tax cut for millionaires and billionaires. You will never see any benefits from this, and it only decreases government revenue to give a handout to these rich people. Quote, to provide relief to the aviation and boating industries and increase the overall efficiency of the luxury tax framework, Budget 2025 announces the government's intention to end the luxury tax on aircraft and vessels as of the day after Budget Day. Keep them yachts coming, people. I'm sure that'll help the working class. Also, outlined in this section is cutting the empty homes tax, a tax that dissuades and penalizes companies and elite from hoarding housing and keeping them empty while we have unhoused Canadians freezing in the streets. Quote, Budget 2025 announces the government's intention to eliminate the underused housing tax as of the 2025 calendar year. Again, this is just a tax cut for the wealthy billionaires and millionaires, corporations, so they can hoard more and more homes across the country. Insanity. Section 5.4, Advancing Indigenous Tax Jurisdiction Frameworks. This part is entirely an aims to do part where they commit to nothing, so that'll be it there. Some support for Indigenous people, for sure. Chapter 5 is the part of the budget that delivers the savings, which is just firing a bunch of public servants, cutting taxes on the wealthy. It's stupid. And where's some of this money going? It's going as a wealth transfer to the richest Canadians, millionaires, billionaires. And like that, we have just covered the entire budget. All 5 chapters. I'll give each chapter a grade from A to F. And a reminder that my scale is based on what is good for the working class and improving their material conditions. That would get a higher grade, and elite, wealthy focused policies would get bad. So let's go through and grade these chapters. Chapter 1, Building a Stronger Canadian Economy. So Chapter 1 covered this CEO banker's massive tax cuts for corporations, and it will for sure trickle down this time, guys, I promise. It also included scapegoating immigrants, refugees, international students, and denying Indigenous and First Nations their basic rights. In addition to billions and billions in handouts for the wealthy and massive funds for AI and cryptocurrency. Maybe worst of all somehow is the disastrous climate competitiveness strategy that by Mark Carney's own standard, his own moral standard, is a complete and utter moral failure. The budget's first chapter is a complete stinker with policies that will devastate the already suffering working class. Chapter 1 gets an F. Chapter 2, Shifting from Reliance to Resilience. I'll summarize this chapter as more handouts for billionaires and millionaires in an attempt to diversify our economy. Billions in handouts, including to foreign companies. These handouts are just more of a wealth transfer. The section does include a Buy Canadian thing, which is generally a pro-worker policy. We should be our best customers, and we should focus on local development. Overall, though, is another stinker of a chapter. Handouts for the wealthy. Chapter 2 gets a D. Chapter 3, Empowering Canadians. So this chapter contains the ineffective housing plan consisting of private-public partnership to build houses. A terrible policy for the working class people. Also in this is tax cuts for the rich, like the carbon pricing tax cut, which benefited the wealthy. Housing strategy also does nowhere near enough to address the crisis. Chapter 3 also has 2 small funds for a school food program and a youth climate program. So Chapter 3 overall doesn't come anywhere near close to meeting the moment for the affordability and housing crises that we face. Despite the few pro-worker policies in there, like this chapter gets an F. Chapter 4, Protecting Canadian Sovereignty and Security, mainly describes how Canada will further integrate our military with NATO, massive spending increase on military that has no return on investment. It just increases Canada's integration with the United States. Further integration with NATO, the fascist-led offensive military alliance. This chapter also does not identify Canada's number one threat, the United States. For these reasons, I cannot in good conscience give Chapter 4 anything but an F. Chapter 5, Creating a More Efficient and Effective Government. Chapter 5 is Canada's Doge, the core of the austerity and policies of sacrifice. Austerity and sacrifice is self-evidently not good for the working class. This chapter gets an F. Alright, with all 5 chapters graded, I'm doing the math. 4 Fs, yeah, let's just... The overall budget ranking, it's a big old F. This is going to decimate working class people and will lead to more devastation, destruction, and climate death. Friendly reminder to subscribe to see more of my work and hear more of my thoughts on Canadian politics generally. In closing, here are my final thoughts. Neoliberal trickle-down austerity, destroying the working class and their material conditions to feed the wealthy elite's greed. Sacrificing the working class and our future as a species is stupid. Like the antagonist from the Lorax, stopping the planting trees policy is just like patently ridiculous and evil. It's serving stupid. This budget is also broadly appeasement to the military-industrial complex and American fascism. The few good policies for working class people in this budget are not provided with anywhere near appropriate funding, and you pair that with a massive firing of public servants, and it's just bad for workers overall. This budget also removes environmental protections, contains handouts for oil industry. This budget accelerates climate change, which means accelerating displacement, more refugees, devastation, and death. Massive spending and incurring huge debt for military, AI, and corporate handouts. All that spending and the people are gonna be worse off? We need to sacrifice? Fuck that. The budget does not reference once the climate crisis, which is one of the defining things of our time. This is emblematic to CEO Carney's policy of sacrificing the youth and just pretend that the crisis isn't real, denying the very reality around us. There is no working class reprieve in this budget. There is no hope, and there is no future. This is evil stuff. CEO demands much more social violence, and he should feel ashamed, uncomfortable, and embarrassed to show his face in public. For the working class, this budget is just plain evil. We need working class politics in this country, and socialism is the way, people. No more demonic pacts with capitalism, no more sacrifices. We need policies that actually help everyone universally and uplifts our society to fight for a better future. Socialism. This budget is class war against working class Canadians. Mark Carney, Donald Trump, Israel. I hope everyone enjoyed me covering the budget. Kind of a drier topic, but thank you for sticking it out. Let's see how the budget develops, if it passes. Thank you all so much for listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Really appreciate it. Peace and love, everyone. Bye-bye.